let's
jump
go
into
back
Purim.
to the Purim story,
Right.
Because we have some more time, and I feel like this is something that people would be interested, especially in our community. So take it away.
Oh, okay. Well, let's just put it in terms of its putative setting, right? Like where we traditionally understand the Book of Esther to happen in history, and then we can look at some of the problems with that. The Book of Esther is set in the period of the Babylonian exile. Just to give a very cursory overview for people who may not be as familiar with this, Jews are living in the land of Israel, and they have a split in the region. The 10 tribes that are associated with the northern kingdom of Israel are at an on-again, off-again war with the kingdom of Judah in the south. And then in the late 8th century, around the 720s, there is an Assyrian invasion, and that northern kingdom is destroyed. A large amount of the population is sent away to other parts of what would be today Syria and Lebanon, and the Kurdish region of Iraq, and then a little bit further to the east towards Iran. And those are the, so to speak, 10 lost tribes that everyone's always looking for nowadays. It's not exactly historically correct. It's not like we actually lost the 10 tribes, but we definitely did have a major population upheaval, which was typical for the period. Then the political activity of Jews is concentrated in the south around Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah. And they also have difficult relations with the Assyrians and following them with the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is based in what would be today Iraq and just a little bit to the north of Kuwait. And that ends dramatically in the year 586 when Nebuchadnezzar comes and destroys the Judean kingdom and has a massive population transfer to the land of Babylonia. This is the Babylonian expulsion that it lasts from about the year 586 to about the year 539 by the traditional historical count of years. There is some machlokas over exactly how to calculate those years, but that's the standard academic approach. In the year 539, the new king Cyrus proclaims liberty with this remarkable cylindrical document that says, okay, everybody is free to go home now. You can resume your Jewish activities or whatever religious activities you want. A small minority of the Jews living in Babylonia now for 50, 60 odd years have said, well, it's actually pretty nice here. So a large majority decide to stay, and they constitute the bulk of the Persian kingdom and the Iraqi Jewish communities to this day. Very tiny now, of course, because of 20th century developments. And then a small minority actually head back to Israel under Ezra and reestablish a polity, rebuild the temple, the initiation of the Second Temple period. And this is what's called the Persian period of Jewish history because Israel is now part of the Persian Empire. It's called Yahud at this time. That's basically where we get the term Jews from this era. So the story of the Book of Esther has as its setting the land of Babylonia between that exile and that return. That's where we put it. So middle of the 6th century before the Common Era.
Very interesting. And they, another thing I want to point out about Yehuda, we have Mordechai Ish Yehudi, but he's Ish Yemini. So he's obviously from the tribe of Benjamin, Mordechai Yehudi, but they were called Jews for the first time. And what a lot of people don't know is that Mordechai is actually not a Jewish name. It originates from Marduk, and right. Esther is Ishtar. We don't actually know Mordechai's Hebrew name, but we do know Esther's Hebrew name was Hadassah. So we want to understand more about the timeline, because who was Ahasuerus? Which was he, Xerxes or Xerxes II? Artaxerxes. This is always up for debate, and I don't know if there's an answer for it, but is there any kind of evidence for a presence in Egypt? Obviously, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but is there some extra biblical source maybe that could help support this theory? So
I don't think I want to weigh in on the debate over which exact Persian king is referred to in the Book of Esther. It is a machlokas, and I don't consider myself sufficiently conversant with the sources to really opine one way or the other. I can say a little bit about what we have in terms of archaeological and epigraphic evidence of the Jews in Babylonia at this time. Unfortunately, none of it points to the specific events described in the Book of Esther. Like, we don't have, a Babylonian account of the story of the Book of Esther, but we definitely have lots of really cool data about the Jewish community in Babylonia at that time. We've got some interesting ostraca, which are basically, one of the favored writing materials back then was broken pots, because, when you've got this very cheap item, clay, and you make it into a pot and then it's broken, it's good for nothing basically, except it's really handy for a writing material. It's less expensive than papyrus, which at any rate is more difficult to procure in certain places. The Chinese invention of paper has not made its way to Persia, when it would, by the way, in the era of Sadia Gaon, it would just like take off. Jews loved paper. We said, fantastic, this is a cheap way of producing documents, and we were early adopters of paper technology. But that's, several hundred years later. The ostraca then would, if you broke a pot, then fine, now you've got some writing material. And so it was reused, recycled. Pottery was actually very commonly used for all kinds of business purposes. And we have some remarkable finds from the city of Nimrud that refer to a lot of people with theophoric Jewish names, meaning they are clearly Semitic names that use Jewish names for God. I'm using the term Jewish maybe a little anachronistically, but, I have, we really like theophoric names, right? Names that invoke the name of God. I have a daughter named Rafaela that, it involves one of the names of God. The third syllable is one of the names of God. I have another son named Eliyahu, also a theophoric name that involves. So when you suddenly find in Babylonia these Semitic theophoric names, it's a good suggestion that they are in fact Jews. We also have lots and lots, besides the ostraca, we have cuneiform documents, which are more formal. These are like, instead of like taking broken pots and then writing things on them, if you're a more established business or you want something more formal, you actually create clay for the purposes of writing, and you use like this little wood-shaped tool that looks a lot like a chopstick. No coincidences there, right? Jews were using chopsticks for writing. Just suggesting. So they would use these wedge-shaped chopsticks to write in Aramaic or in Akkadian sometimes. That includes lots of Jewish information about lots of theophoric names of Jews involved in all kinds of business activities. So we definitely know that there were Jews that were very active, really from the 8th century right through until the Mishnaic and Talmudic periods, and they had quite an advanced civilization, very well integrated. We know that they were involved in all kinds of economic activities. They were actually especially known for their military ability. They were brought into Babylonian units as Jewish units because they fought well together, and a fascinating kind of material that way. Again, as I mentioned, it does not cast a direct light on the events of the Book of Esther, other than in a kind of a, like you mentioned, Kenneth Kitchen earlier, in a kind of corroborating way, to suggest that, yeah, Jews were settled in urban areas. If the king had a feast, it would be not at all, unimaginable that he would invite a lot of Jews to that feast. Jews were well integrated into various sectors of society, things like that.
Yeah, and also Zoroastrian culture was very welcoming to Judaism. So do we see some connection between like the practices of Jews in those days to maybe we see kind of an influence there? Either they getting influenced by us or us getting influenced by them, or is that something you don't want to touch on either?
No, I'm just smiling right now because this is where we're going to have to edit it. I'm actually recording this in my home. It's Friday, so my wife just brought me a nice plate of, believe it or not, egg rolls. There we go.
Wow. You're really trying to fit the stereotype. I don't think we should edit this. We shouldn't edit this out. I think this is great.
Yeah, what stereotype? What are you talking about? Okay, so I'm sorry about that. I'm not going to eat while we talk, but can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, I was just saying, like, do we see any kind of interplay between the Zoroastrian culture and the Jewish culture? Because the Torah even goes so far as the Tanakh goes so far as to call like Cyrus, the Persians, we call him Cyrus, they call him the Mashiach. Like it's a very interesting thing that usually that's reserved for priests or the Messiah. So like there's some kind of thing, there's something happening there that didn't happen before, and I'm just wondering, what is there a connection between like Jews of that time and Zoroastrian culture in any way?
Definitely. Boy, you are just going for the hardest questions here, right? Like I'm choking. These are tough questions. The real guy you should speak to is my colleague Shai Secunda, who has written like amazing works. I mean,
I actually went to one of his. He spoke in Great Neck Synagogue a few years ago. He's a very fascinating guy.
So he is the man when it comes to Zoroastrianism, Babylonian Jews, Persian Jews, the Talmud. He's definitely the person you should speak to. But I can have a shot at it. There are definitely periods when there was less tolerance of Jewish practices, depending on how strong the Zoroastrian faith was in a particular point in history. A great example, I think, of this is if you look at the Bameh Madlikin, which my Ashkenazic friends like to read on Friday nights, right? The second chapter of the Mishnah of Shabbos, which discusses, the possibility that if you're lighting your candles on a particular day, it's Shabbos for you, but it might be a holy day in the Zoroastrian calendar in which fire was not to be kindled, and you can get a huge amount of trouble. And the Mishnah actually says, under those circumstances, if you need to, you can put out the candle rather than have a horde of angry Zoroastrians break down your door. There are other times when, we got along very famously with the Zoroastrians, and that's not surprising given the fact that on a meta historical level, or perhaps on a macro historical level, Jews are readily influenced by the cultures in which they live. Their diasporic cultures are often, very, very deeply affected by the standards and norms of the societies in which they live. It's interesting to note where they draw the line, though. For example, I was just reading recently the work of the eminent classic Jewish scholar Salo Baron, who wrote, this phenomenal work. It's like 16 volumes, The Social and Religious History of the Jews. It is like, without doubt, the best history of the Jews ever written. The only problem is you need to have a PhD just to really appreciate it, because it just assumes you know so much before you actually walk through it. And he makes the very salient observation that the Jews in Babylonia loved the Babylonian months of the year, even if they're named after Babylonian gods. No problem. Tammuz, we love it. That's fine. And so we have incorporated the Babylonian months. But when it comes to Shabbos, Jews brought Shabbos to the world. Jews brought that seventh day worship to the world. We said, we are not going to accept like days of the week like we have in English as being acceptable for Jewish usage. We have Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, day 1, day 2. We don't even try to mess with those names. And Shabbat is the only day that has its own name. So there, we will draw lines as to when we will absorb outside culture and when we will refuse it or reject it. So in terms of our relationship with the Zoroastrians, there are a lot of things that we accepted. You see it also in Christianity, by the way. They also had that kind of overlay of Zoroastrianism in their texts. And there are times when we had tremendous conflict with them. I'm going to actually have to move these egg rolls behind my computer because I'm looking at them. I just want to eat one egg roll, but no, I'm not going to do it. One thing that I thought of that there was a major conflict with Zoroastrians is burial practices, right? Because their favored method of burial was exposure. meaning you take the body and you leave it out there for the birds of the sky and carrion eaters to eat it. And that was, we've had some pretty wacky forms of burial in Judaism. We've had crypt burial,
right?
ossuaries. We've had likutei atzamos, where we actually collect up the bones and we have a celebration on the yard site as we move the bones. But we are definitely not into exposure as a means of treating our dead. And so we had a lot of conflict with them over those issues. Yeah. The way in which we practice Hilchas Nida, also, I haven't read it yet, but Professor Secunda has a new book out on that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that. It's apparently a lot of fascinating, customs that have been absorbed, largely because they also had very similar attitudes towards menstruation. But I haven't read the book yet, so I don't know what to say.
Sure. Wow. It's so interesting. And also, obviously, I don't think the Torah or Judaism ever was against, influence from the outside. Like you said, there was always lines in the sand we won't cross. Like, for instance, Hellenism and, the Socratic method is very much influential on the way Jews, like the Talmudic Jews are, the Jews who study the Talmud, the way we practice the Chavruta style kind of questions and answers and that whole style. So there's definitely a lot of that. And actually, we were just discussing this yesterday, because a lot of people, for example, the Rambam, the people will say, well, he was an Aristotelian, and we always say, like, that was the greatest tool for arriving at logical conclusions that he had at his disposal. But it wasn't necessarily, it didn't mean that he was an Aristotelian. In fact,
it wasn't religiously Aristotelian.
Right. He actually argued on very, very key points against Aristotle, whether demonology or the eternality of the universe and all that. So, what a lot of people do is they'll miscast, people like the Rambam and say, oh, he was just an Aristotelian, he was a Greek. Where in fact, he just used the tools at his, that were available to him to kind of
maximize.
Exactly. Try to take, try to use that to our benefit, to make the Torah, the arguments for the Torah even stronger.
I think that's a very sophisticated observation. You guys are like really smart, it's impressive.
Well, I went to Touro. Come on.
Yeah, we had, I don't, you have to come back to Torah. Got to do your graduate degree there, because these are smart things. And I think if we can just sharpen your observation there, what's especially useful, if we take Rambam as an example, is seeing when they said ad kan. Like, what are the boundaries? Just like Salo Baron says, we'll accept the Babylonian months, we won't accept the names of the Babylonian days of the week. So, for example, I'm reminded the Rambam, he basically just plagiarized straight from the Nicomachean Ethics when it comes to the issue of the golden mean, right? Just to summarize for people maybe not as familiar with it, the Aristotle originally articulated this. The Rambam discusses it in his Hilchas Deos, and it's a great tool. I've had many very pleasant sessions learning with my children as we go over it. He argues, Aristotle, and then Maimonides follows on, says that every single character trait has a balance between excess on the one hand and deficiency on the other. So, for example, what is courage? Courage is the midpoint between cowardice and recklessness. Recklessness means you have too much courage and you take unnecessary risks. And cowardice means you're not willing to take normal risks. So courage is kind of like finding that midpoint. And he says this is true of all the midos except for two. And this is not like Aristotle. So where Maimonides says, I'm getting off the Aristotle train right now, is when it comes to the stops of humility and anger. He says you should always have an excess of humility, maybe because, he doesn't actually say why, but I'm sort of guessing now, maybe it's because we naturally kind of skew away from humility towards egotism too much. And so therefore we have to put extra gas on humility all the time. And anger, you can only, as I'm sure you're familiar with the famous phrase that the Rambam uses, you can only show external anger. You can only pretend to be angry for didactic or pedagogic purposes so that your children will, pay attention or something, but you can never actually be angry in your heart. You have to strive to have a total deficiency of anger. So I think trying to understand what is of the greatest value of Judaism writ large often requires us to look at where we disagree with the cultures that surround us.
That's so beautiful. I see
Thank you
what
so
you're
much.
Amazing.
And I said that without touching those egg rolls. Okay.
Amazing.
We don't want
That's like-
to stop you from eating those egg rolls, but do you have
No,
anything?
it's like they're like kryptonite for
Yeah.
Clark Kent, you know?
As you were going through that, I remember when, like, with the Rambam, with the humility and the anger, how he veers off of the main course. You see, there's a lot of lumdus on that, if you know what I like. There's tons of lumdus, but the way you just put it, the framework you put it in, actually simplified it and just meaning he was just going with Aristotle, but then at these junctures he felt that you need to veer off, and I just feel like it was you simplified something that people have gone into many different trajectories in order to try to understand how the Rambam understands that. I just thought you just kind of simplified it really nicely.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say so.
Well, thank you so much for this time that you've given us, and we hope to do it again. And,
My pleasure.